Hi everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today at Cyber House Party to talk about this incredibly important issue that's plaguing not only the cybersecurity industry, but society in general. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Eleanor Dalloway, Editorial Director at Info's Security magazine, and I wrote recently about trolling and online harassment for the Q1 issue of the magazine. This is a topic that's become really close to my heart. We've got an amazing panel today, packed with people that are passionate about this, desperate to make a difference and up for a really good conversation around this topic. So thank you all for being here, and thanks to Cyber House Party for having us. If you're not following Cyber House Party on Twitter or LinkedIn, please do. Okay, so let me introduce the panel. We've got Stuart Peck, who's the Director of Cybersecurity Strategy and the founder of the online community, the Many Hats Club. He's an open source intelligent subject partner expert and has been involved in many investigations into missing people, cybercrime and online harassment. So hi, Stu.
Hey.
Then we've got Charlotte Hopper, who is the Helpline Director at Cyber Helpline, specialising in cyber stalking and focusing on scaling to meet demand and provide a support service for victims of cybercrime. Charlotte's educational and research background is in policing and consumer genetic database privacy. So thanks for being here, Charlotte.
Hi.
And finally, we've got Lisa Forte, who is the partner at Red Goat Cybersecurity, and the host of the Rebooting YouTube channel and podcast series. Hey, Lisa.
Hiya.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. Now all those introductions out of the way, let's get started by taking a look at the different types of online harassment. We'll start with you, Lisa, please. And we spoke for my trolling feature, and I can't unhear some of the things that you told me. And I know that for you, you began to experience online harassment once your Twitter account received, I think you said the magic number 15,000. So can you tell us a little bit about the behaviours, the trolling and the abuse that you've suffered, please?
Yeah, so I think myself and a number of other people, once they got to sort of 10 to 15,000 followers, things sort of took a bit of a dark turn. And it's funny because it's not so much little bits of criticism here and there, potentially a little bit of aggressive behavior, that's all fine. But it actually started to migrate into death threats, into some pretty horrible imagery, none of which apparently violated the platform's terms of use, which was an interesting angle. Everything that gets reported didn't really amount to anything. And then sort of as a side part, and something I was talking to a number of younger sort of InfoSec women about today actually, is the fact that on LinkedIn, the number of nude images from gentlemen across the profession that send in is just enormous. And I really wasn't expecting it. And I think I probably should have done, and people warned me that it would be like that. And I ignored them, and that was probably to my peril.
It's absolutely not fine. But okay, thank you so much. Charlotte, in my introduction, I mentioned that you specialise in cyber stalking. Can you tell us exactly what cyber stalking is, like the definition, and how it affects its victims?
Yeah, sure. So we see so many different types of cyber stalking, and it differs from harassment in that there might be a physical risk, or there's just a few different ways that are combined that this is happening. And the sort of people that we see committing cyber stalking, it could be that it's somebody who's an ex-partner and wants reconciliation, to somebody that wants revenge, to just being a stranger who's found somebody online that they want to target.
Typically, what's the sort of profile of the victim of cyber stalking, or is it a complete wide array of people that you see being victimised by this?
It can be so different, and especially during the pandemic and lockdown, we've seen that it's really varied even more than it used to. The typical victim of cyber stalking, it tends to be a female. It's been a long-term issue that's been ongoing for years for them. The stalker tends to be an ex-partner or unknown to them, and it tends to be that they've really lost trust in technology as a whole. So however the issues happened, they've kind of lost trust in their whole online environment, whether that's their devices or their accounts. And that tends to be what we see, is that concern and hypervigilance of online and technology in general.
How often do you see the merging of the cyber world and the physical world when it comes to stalking? Do you quite often see one go into the other?
Yeah, really often actually. And the most interesting thing with that tends to be that it will be like location data, or even that usually there tends to have been physical access to the device in the past, which is how the stalking's come about. And what we see a lot is that people come to us and say, I think somebody's installed a tracker on my phone, or I think somebody sent me malicious software, which is how they're doing all of this. And what tends to have happened is somebody's just helped them set their account up, or they've had physical access in the past, and that's how they've gained access to the information that they have. So the physical side of things tends to go along the cyber side of things. The instances where we might see that it's cyber on its own is where it's a complete stranger that somebody's just found online.
It's so frightening. Okay, thank you. Stu, I know you can't be specific, but your work at the National Child Protection Task Force means that you do a lot of work around harassment that affects children, teenagers, and is often incredibly serious. Can you tell us a bit about the work you're doing there, please?
Yeah, I guess, I can't talk about any cases, but the work that the National Child Protection Task Force does as a non-profit is to locate, the darker side trafficked children, and then on the so it's less serious side is the missing children. And of course, a lot of these things can be those original reasons why those kids may have gone missing could be down to things like online harassment or bullying or things escalating. And there are always those kind of initial signs of those problems that may be things that have been shared, or things that kids oversharing, or too much exposure on social media that could actually potentially lead them to become victimized, or even the darker side, that kind of initial cyber stalking becomes grooming and things like this. So you kind of see that harassment on one side of things, the kind of real kind of abusive harassment that could potentially lead to someone actually, doing something quite damaging to themselves, or it could actually lead to someone actually going and getting out of their environment and getting away from everything. And obviously that's quite concerning as well. It's not always the case, but it has been some cases that I investigated outside of the National Child Protection Task Force in terms of some of the work that I've been doing, where I've seen actual harassment from an actual obsession from kids to other kids using hacking as a technique to kind of hack into someone's webcam so they can spy on another child at the same peer group, but using their older brother and sister, for example, to do that. So there's actually been a whole range of cases where it's been pretty sinister stuff, actually, and the outcome of it is always quite sinister in itself as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Stu. So I guess it's probably time to sort of turn it around a little bit and start thinking about what we can do to protect, as individuals, to protect ourselves and look after ourselves online. Lisa, you sort of spoke about how when people say really hurtful things to you, you don't care anymore, and you don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But what's your advice for dealing with trolls, and how have you got yourself to a position where you can sort of shrug it off?
I don't think I'm in a position where everything goes over my head at all. I've had probably one of the darkest years from that perspective. And I have learned that people often say to you, oh, just block them on this, block them on that. That doesn't work. If you do that, you are showing them, personally, I think you're showing them that you care, they've got to you, they've got you on the run. And if you block them, it's going to get worse. My personal feelings towards it, and having spoken to counsellors about it, is that actually it's about your personal resilience and understanding why you're reacting the way you are and how to stop that. But as Charlotte said, she said something about anxiety of using technology. And that happens to me when I see loads of notifications on Twitter. Instantly, I feel sweaty. I feel like my heart's racing. I feel like, oh my God, something terrible has happened here. It's going to be horrendous. And that's what it's done. And I don't know what the solution is from that perspective. I think it's got to be about personal resilience, or you've got to get to that point where you just think enough's enough and I've got to come off social media.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. And, what's that trade-off, and at what stage do you have to make that decision that actually this is doing more harm than it is good for me? But, the flip side of that is people shouldn't be bullied into that decision. That should be a decision that somebody makes for their own personal reasons, not that's being forced by other people's unacceptable behaviour. You mentioned about working with a counsellor around this. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, is that something you went specifically to the counsellor for because of what was happening to you online?
Yeah, so it got so bad at one point. I had a situation where somebody was taking photos of me in Sainsbury's and then messaging them with abusive messages on various social media platforms. So it had become a little bit more physical than just purely cyber. And so I notified the police, and the police started an investigation, and they actually encouraged me to go and speak to a counsellor and go to speak to, I think they called it a victim therapist or victim support therapist. And they were saying that the pandemic has caused such an increase in this, and the only real thing that they can do is offer victim support because the platforms don't share anything. So the police end up coming up against a bit of a wall in terms of hunting these people down. So personally, yeah, I think it's a really, really good, healthy thing to go and do, and it really helps you cope with any kind of thing that goes beyond that just criticism and I disagree with you and this is why, into abuse.
Yeah, so Charlotte, actually on that note, do you have tips for people on how to protect their own privacy and their security online, specifically in relation to your area of specialism?
Yeah, so I think I'm sure the people here know two-factor authentication, passwords. That's the stuff we're always told, think about and consider. I think physical access and considering that is so important too. Sometimes you don't know if people in your household have malicious intentions, and that's something that we see a lot, again, like I said, is the physical access side of things. But it's also about using the tools that social media provide. Sometimes they're great, some other times they aren't, with the reporting functions, the blocking functions. And like Lisa said, I think it's so true that in terms of making your account really private and blocking people, you shouldn't have to get to that extent because of somebody else. It should totally be off your own back. Unfortunately, sometimes it gets to the extent where people feel like, is there any option? And in terms of securing stuff, there's always settings on so many websites now that allow you to see what sessions you've got logged in on other devices.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Charlotte sort of set you up there for to go into, the evidence gathering and maybe recognising patterns of behaviour and stuff like that. So could you talk us through that, perhaps? Yeah,
that was a perfect segue. Look at that. So I think there's a couple of things to consider, right? So attackers and the kind of cyber stalkers or trolls or whatever name you want to give them, the adversaries, right? They are going to take some degree of action to protect their identity, but they don't always do that. They might have a particular username they've used for a while. They might have backups of those usernames. They may have profile pictures which might have some EXIF data in them. So that's the metadata within the images that you can use. There's a bunch of tools that you can do and the everyday person can use to really kind of understand the patterns and behaviors. So maybe they target you at certain times, right? And maybe they target you at certain times a day. So you might say, well, actually, hang on a second, they're targeting me only from 2 p.m. in the afternoon until late in the evening. That could be they're US based, or it could be they're targeting really early in the morning at like 6 o'clock in the morning. And maybe they're slightly earlier times, or maybe they're European time zone. So you can start to look at patterns. There's some really good tools to look at some accounts to actually work out where people are based. There's like something called Tinfo Leak, which basically looks at the if you're looking at a Twitter account, you can dump the Twitter account data and you can start to crawl through the data, and it'll tell you what operating system they're using. It'll tell you what information they're using and what time zone they might be in. It'll show you patterns of when they log on and all that kind of stuff as well. Loads of really good data you can get. And the importance here is about using all the open source tools that are out there, which there are many, and I have released I have got a spreadsheet which I developed a while ago, which has all the tools for finding missing people. You can use that same spreadsheet to find your adversary, to find information on your adversary. And it's really about following the data. So looking at when someone's targeted you, how they're targeting you, what language they're using, patterns. And they'll have the same styles of writing. They'll log in at similar sort of times, because people are creatures of habit. And we like to do things in a certain way. As much as we try to hide these things, unless they're completely automating something, then they're gonna have a certain pattern, and you can pick that out quite easily. Like I said, there are a bunch of tools, and evidence, as Charlotte said, evidence everything. No matter how insignificant you may think it is, evidence it. And if you're really struggling, there are plenty of people out there with good open source intelligence expertise that will be able to support you and help you find the information you need to evidence, not to uncover the identity and not to commit some vigilante crime, because I'm very against that, but actually to evidence what you're gathering. And the key thing about open source intelligence is you are an observer. You should not interact. You should not, as an investigator, you should not muddy the waters. You are literally there to almost to forensically capture what's happening, document and categorize the stuff that's really important. So you can actually then put that forward to law enforcement to say, this is what we've gathered, this is the evidence, this is the linkage of the data to prove that this is the identity or the likely identity of this person, and here's the evidence to support that, because that's the information that law enforcement really struggle with.
It's really good advice. Yeah, really good advice, Stu. Thank you. I think what I wanted to sort of start to sort of wind up the session by doing is also looking at, there's a lot of pieces there on what we can do as individuals to help ourselves and protect ourselves online. But at an industry level, is there anything we can be doing together, combined, to try and combat online harassment? And Charlotte, you gave some really great tips around how to protect privacy and all the different things we can do to keep ourselves as individuals protected. What about the awareness piece around that? Like, how do we get that message out there? Because it's one thing for us as sort of industry professionals and people that are reasonably technically minded to understand, but it's quite another to kind of get that message out there to the 14 and 15-year-olds that Stu was referencing, and, you know, people that aren't as technical as we are in this industry. So what do you think we can do around that awareness piece, if anything?
Sure. I think sometimes it's so easy to take for granted things like two-factor authentication and passwords and like making sure it's all secure, because you never really think that's going to happen to you, even in the industry or whether that's other people. It's always something that's kind of on the back of your mind, I think. So I think it is really spreading awareness of what all of these security tools do and how easy they really are to implement, even between friends and family.
And what's the role of schools or parents in this for the children and the teenagers you were talking about earlier? Is that the responsibility of teachers? Is it the responsibility of parents or siblings? Or is there anything as an industry that we can do, you know, above and beyond any of that?
I think it's everyone as a whole, really. Schools are so important in that, and but I think again, like when I was in school, it was, you get told all of these things and it goes over your head. So hearing it from people that are actually in the industry and have seen these things happen, I think is where the shock factor, I guess, really lies in it. Sometimes just hearing it from your teachers and your parents and seeing the campaigns that are aimed towards children, it's very much like, yeah, you can do this, but there's never the understanding of what the implications of not doing that are.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Stu, how can industry assist and perhaps unify the efforts of the National Child Protection Task Force and other organisations and departments that are working together? Obviously, how can we get that solidarity and work better?
Oh, that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think there are some, you know, really good, you know, non-profits out there that are doing really good work, right? So you think about from a child vulnerable people kind of perspective, you have like National Child Protection Task Force, as we mentioned, who are, you know, a US-based non-profit, but they operate internationally. You have the Innocent Lives Foundation, which is an amazing organization which deals with other types of challenges. But you know, we're dealing with this kind of stalking and harassment and you know, the education around it. I do feel there is a bit of a gap, if I'm being honest. There are obviously like lots of resources. Cyber Helpline, absolutely fantastic organization, and I know a lot of the people that work there, and it's doing some really great things. But I do feel there is this kind of education gap and actually support structure gap. And you know, I'm not saying we should all rally and create a non-profit dealing with online harassment trolling. Well, that would be an amazing thing, right? But I think there is definitely a kind of big gap around pulling that expertise together and providing that kind of resources, training and support structure, because you do need to provide support and you do need when you're dealing with someone in your life, and the things that Lisa mentioned, right, they're absolutely dreadful. You're not having your cyber life, your online life invaded. Now it's getting into your personal space and your potentially your safety being affected. So these are things which are real issues. These aren't just people online just going, hey, saying some horrible comments. This has a massive impact on the mental health, the safety, and the well-being of people who never asked for this, right? They're just, going out there, they're doing their own business, and suddenly someone has taken issue with something that maybe they said, or the way they look, or because they're being successful, or whatever it may be, and they're taking shots. So I haven't really answered your question. And what can we do? But look, I think as a community, okay, we have to kind of stand behind this. We have to say enough's enough, right? And we have to kind of say, look, people can't keep doing this. They're going to keep doing it, right? But because it's easy, like I said, it's easy to create a fake account. I mean, I have 250 fake accounts, right? That's a high number of fake accounts, but they're all used for non-malicious purposes. Don't look at me like that. They are used for non-malicious purposes, for open source intelligence reasons and things like this, right? But the idea behind it is that it's easy to create these accounts. It's easy to create an account. It gets burned, you create a new account, you continue, right? And and if you don't take the right precautions, and especially trolls, they don't take enough precautions, they do trip up, they mix their legends, they do make a mistake, and it's not realizing that is the vital information that could uncover their real IP address. So I think we've got to get better at discovering these things, and we've got to get better at telling people how to protect yourself, and protecting your privacy is not just about, and what Charlotte said is absolutely right, but it's also about identifying the information that you want to be private that is actually currently public, right? So saying this information is public, I don't think that should be public, that should be private, and take action on it, and actually look at yourself as an attacker would, right? And discover what information's out there on you, and then you'll actually have a nice bit of kind of reality factor, like, hey, I'm actually really exposed, and there's lots of information I'm not comfortable being out there on me, and that you'd probably the people would start taking the appropriate action, and this would be a lot less of an issue. That's my 2 pennies worth, and I think I'll be quiet now.
You must have a really good password manager for those 250 different accounts.
I have 4 different password managers now to manage different accounts. Yeah.
Amazing. Finally, Lisa, I just wanted to come to you, see if you've got any other sort of last pieces of advice or calls to actions or rallying for the industry on any of this stuff.
I think there are 3 things really. The first thing is, I think you need to sit down and think to yourself, if I'm going to build a big public profile, this is going to happen to me. Do I want that? Do I want my personal life potentially sort of a nuclear bomb thrown into it potentially, and myself feel like you do when you're being bullied? And if you really think, you know what, I just want to enjoy my life, then consider that. That's the first thing. The second thing I think that's really important is, if you do end up being trolled, being stalked, being bullied, whatever you said, whatever it is, go and talk to people, go and talk about it to people like Stu, to the cyber helpline, to other people in your community. But make sure that when you do that, you don't encourage a mob mentality of people jumping on there and essentially acting like trolls on the person who said something horrible to you, because then it just creates a snowball effect. So that's the other thing. And then just to reiterate really what Stu and Charlotte said, just I collected everything, I screenshotted everything. And because of that, we managed to work out who it was. If I hadn't done that, those accounts would have been burned and I would have lost all of that data. So it's really, really important that if people are doing that, that you are actually recording it.
I'm really glad you mentioned that sort of the mob mentality thing, actually, because that came up a lot in the feature I wrote. And the negative things that can come from that mob mentality, and like you say, quite counterproductive, in that almost becomes a trolling in its own form. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Okay, so sadly I'm under strict orders to finish this panel up, and we've only really scratched the surface, so I wish we had longer, but thank you so much to our panel today, and you're all amazing. And thank you to everyone for watching. Thank you for all the donations so far. If you haven't yet donated and you can spare a little, please do. Finally, we wanted to end on a really positive note with the wonderful story of 10-year-old Charlie from Wokingham, whose experience of being bullied started the viral Cheer Up Charlie campaign. After suffering harassment both online and face-to-face, all because of his love for the West End. He finally found the support of some leading West End stars to join him on his single, which was released in November 2020 at the start of the National Anti-Bullying Week. This just goes to show that there's always somebody out there to help you. And I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did, but hopefully with a few less tears. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and enjoy the video.
Have you ever felt like nobody was there? Have you ever felt forgotten in the middle of nowhere? Have you ever felt like you could disappear? Like you could fall and no one would hear? Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need someone to carry you,
when you're broken on the ground,